This is Stokesay Castle in Shropshire, a 750-year-old medieval fortified manor house and one of the best preserved in all of England. Let's go inside and take a look. It was built in the 1280s by a man called Lawrence of Ludlow, a wealthy wool merchant who'd made a staggering amount of money in sheep, and he wanted everyone to know about it. Lawrence loved hosting lavish feasts here at the banqueting hall at Stokesay, serving prime cuts of meat and fish and the finest wine that Europe had to offer. Here's where it gets interesting. In 2023, we found evidence of just such medieval feasting here underneath the floor in the Great Hall. Animal bones, oyster shells here in landlocked Shropshire, and fragments of window glass at a time when glass windows were a real luxury. But these aren't just random scraps. This is evidence of decadent feasting, evidence of Lawrence's wealth and power and status. But I also think it's evidence of something else. The names and the stories of the people who we never got to know. The people who made all of this possible. So Louise, this Lawrence of Ludlow, he was a wealthy man, he was a wool merchant, and he wasn't sheepish about flaunting his wealth. Tell me a bit more about him. How did he come to own the place? What did he do to it?
He had bought the estate of Stokesay and then he built this property in the 1280s and 1290s on the main road between Ludlow and Shrewsbury, and it would have been visible from anyone making the journey along that road, so that it was a display of wealth and they knew that he was here and he had arrived.
We're in 1290 then, and Lawrence is hosting the Bishop of Hereford here in the Great Hall for a banquet. Tell me about what that would have looked like, what would have been happening in here.
So the Bishop of Hereford was hosted here by Lawrence in 1290 in the Great Hall where we're standing. And there's a really good record of what the Bishop of Hereford paid for in terms of food at that feast that shows that it was a high status feast and a high status event.
During the initial excavation in 2023, I know you thought there wasn't much to see here under the floor in the Great Hall, but recent discoveries suggest there's a bit of a treasure trove of medieval mementos under here.
Well, when we undertook the excavation of the floor, we were trying to understand what the build-up of the floor was so that we could formulate our repairs. So we weren't necessarily looking for any finds. So it was only 2 years later, when the post-excavation analysis has been done, that actually within the spoil that was taken out of the pit, we found that there were animal bones, oyster shells, mussel shells, and pieces of glass as well, which was a surprise because we hadn't seen any evidence of that on the day that it was taken out because they were such small fragments. But it goes to tell a story of what had been happening here in the Great Hall in earlier periods.
So the unexpected finds then from under the floor from 2023 suggest that both the occasion of the feast and the building itself are testament to Lawrence's power and wealth and status. Is that right?
That's right. So the oysters give an indication that there was high status food items being eaten here, and also glass was one of the items that was found, and we think it's window glass. The window openings that we've got here today with the lattice over them would have originally have glazing in the top part with shutters at the bottom. The amazing ceiling that we've got here is it's a crock roof. There would have been a lot more colour and decoration, plaster on the walls, perhaps tapestries. So if you came in here, you would have been impressed. The kitchen would have been outside. We know from later records and illustrations that the kitchen was probably a separate structure outside that doesn't exist anymore. There would have been a screen across this end of the hall that would have separated the kind of service end of the hall from the higher status end where the high table was. And there would have been people that served the food at table, there would have been people that looked after the horses out in the stables, and there would have been servants who looked after Lawrence and his family. So yeah, quite a number of people to run a household like this.
But these are people whose names and stories ultimately we don't know, we don't get to find out about because they're not in the record. You know, we know so much about Lawrence and his business and his buildings that still stand today, but these are people ultimately who are lost to history.
That's right. We know from comparable accounts at other properties the types and the numbers of people that would have helped to run a household like this and an estate like this.
What an amazing place and an amazing story. Under this floor, they found the remains of a great medieval feast. These objects have been carefully removed and taken to Fort Cumberland in Portsmouth, Historic England's state-of-the-art facility, where a team of specialists are hard at work trying to uncover exactly what they are, how old they are, and most importantly, what they mean.
Currently, I've been working on the Stokesay Castle animal bone assemblage. In the assemblage, there's a range of species, and they include the domestic livestock like cattle, pigs, sheep and goat. We also have evidence of woodcock, of goose, and rabbit. We do have a number of specimens with chop marks and cut marks. For example, the femur was chopped off just below the articulation with the hip bone, and then it was further fragmented down 2 planes. And this would have been to disarticulate it from the hip, and also then to maybe prepare it into smaller joints of meat. We also have ribs, which have quite heavy chopping through them, and vertebrae that show that carcasses were split midline. What I've noticed on the bones is that a lot of the remains have gnaw marks from dogs. So this suggests that some of the waste from meals would have been kicking about on the floor, maybe not cleared away immediately. And these gradually got swept up and deposited in with fresher waste into the pit that was excavated. There would have been a range of people helping to support this lifestyle. One of the specimens that's interesting is woodcock. So this is a wild species, so it would have had to be hunted. So there would have been fowlers either supplying the castle, or they could have been purchased at market. Woodcock are quite a high status item in medieval diet. For the early warrens, you would have needed people to manage those, the warreners. We have evidence of almost newborn animals right through to older animals, so it's probable that some of this livestock came from the estates of the manor itself. So you would have needed farmers and shepherds to raise these animals. And then in the kitchen, we have these signs of butchery. We suspect that either whole animals were butchered nearby, or part carcasses were brought into the kitchens and further processed. So there would have been quite a lot of further processing going on within the kitchens. And then you would have had people serving this food.
I have analyzed some of the glass fragments found on the floor of the Great Hall. This type of glass was produced in Europe from the 14th century, but was not produced in England until the late 16th century.
Radiocarbon is a radioactive isotope that's within all of us, and as we're alive, we take it in from the atmosphere. But on our deaths, we stop taking in new radiocarbon and it decays. So that process of decay is what I'm measuring to tell you how old something is. If all of the dates from the 4 different samples come back as being the same, then maybe we can say that we're looking at the remains of one lavish meal that was buried at the same time. But if they come back of a range of different dates, then what we could be looking at is a more extended period of dining within the hall and the remains of multiple meals that have built up over a much longer period. It's a very tangible link to the past. You know, we still have big meals on special occasions today. You know, we eat out for birthdays or anniversaries. So we can imagine people in the past doing the same sorts of things, of going for special foods on special occasions. So even though we don't know maybe exactly what it was they were celebrating, why they were having these meals, it's still a really nice connection to those people.
4 years after hosting the Bishop of Hereford for his feast, Lawrence was dead. Drowned in a shipwreck off the Suffolk coast, he'd been on a mission for the king, carrying wool and money to England's allies in Flanders. A chronicler at the time wrote that he was swallowed by the waves in a ship full of wool. But his descendants remained at Stokesay for hundreds of years. Every one of those oysters was caught by someone. The glass was made somewhere, shipped somewhere, sold to somebody. The meat was prepared and served by people who worked in this building, whose labour is embedded in every one of those objects. We don't know their names. They weren't written down in the same way that Lawrence was, but they're here, in the fragments under the floor. That floor is now being repaired. The building, 700 years later, still stands strong. But I think the question isn't just what happened here, it's whose stories we choose to tell when we look at a place like this.